On April 13, 2024, Iran launched over 300 drones and missiles at Israel, the largest direct attack on Israeli territory in the history of the Islamic Republic. And within 48 hours, every major Western government had declared it a failure. 99% interception rate, no strategic damage, Iran exposed as a paper tiger. The narrative was decided before the debris had even cooled. I want you to hold on to that 99% figure, because by the end of this video, it is going to mean something completely different to you than it does right now. Here is what I want to argue today. Not that Iran succeeded tactically, it did not in the conventional sense, but that America and its partners looked at that attack, called it a defeat, and in doing so, revealed exactly the blind spot that Iran has been engineering for the past decade. The response plan that Washington is now building, the deterrence posture, the escalation ladder, the red lines, is structured around a version of Iran that no longer exists. And the real question is not what Iran does next. The real question is whether America's entire framework for answering that question has already failed before the question was even asked. That is what we are going to spend the next 27 minutes on. Let me start with the wrong question, because the wrong question is everywhere right now. Every serious analyst, every think tank brief, every cable news segment is asking some version of the same thing. Will Iran escalate? Will it strike again? Will the proxies move? Is Hezbollah next? Is the Strait of Hormuz in play? These are tactically coherent questions. They are also strategically useless. And I want to explain precisely why. When you ask, will Iran escalate? You are implicitly assuming that Iran's decision-making is reactive, that it sits at the bottom of an escalation ladder, waiting for America or Israel to move, and then calculating its response from a position of constraint. That frame feels correct because it has been the dominant Western frame for 40 years. Iran is a revisionist actor, disruptive but fundamentally deterrable, fundamentally subordinate to American escalation dominance. The problem is that frame stopped being accurate sometime around 2016, and Washington has not updated the map. The right question is not, will Iran escalate? The right question is this: has Iran already moved to a position where American escalation dominance is structurally obsolete? And is the April 2024 attack the moment that transition became publicly legible? That is a different question. It demands a different framework, and that framework has a name. I want to introduce you to what strategic theorists call cost imposition warfare. Not attrition, not deterrence, not compellence, cost imposition. The deliberate, patient degradation of an adversary's capacity to sustain a strategic posture without ever triggering the full military response that would end the game. This is not a new concept. The United States used a version of it against the Soviet Union throughout the 1980s. Bleed the adversary slowly, force them to spend, force them to reveal, force them to exhaust their reserve capacity in responding to moves that cost you a fraction of what they cost the defender. Ronald Reagan's military buildup was not designed purely to win a war. It was designed to make the Soviet Union too expensive to sustain. Iran has been running a version of this logic against America and Israel for the better part of 15 years, but it has been running it in reverse. And the April 2024 attack was not the opening move, it was the disclosure. Hold on to that word, disclosure. We are coming back to it. To understand the framework properly, you need to understand three structural realities about where Iran actually sits right now, not where analysts assumed it sat in 2015. Not the Iran of the nuclear deal optimism, the Iran of 2024 and beyond. First reality, Iran's drone and missile arsenal is no longer a threat instrument. It is a cost instrument. This distinction is critical, and almost nobody in mainstream coverage is making it. A threat instrument is a weapon whose value lies in whether it can penetrate defenses and cause damage. By that standard, yes, a 99% interception rate looks like defeat. But a cost instrument is a weapon whose value lies in how much the adversary must spend to neutralize it. And this is where the math becomes uncomfortable for Washington. The interceptors used to shoot down Iranian drones and missiles in April 2024 cost between $1 and $3 million per unit on the lower end, and up to $4 million for advanced Arrow and David's Sling interceptors. The Iranian drones being shot down cost between $20,000 and $50,000 each. Some estimates put Shahed variants closer to $10,000. That is not a typo. Iran was spending tens of thousands. America and Israel were spending millions per shot, 300 incoming projectiles. Even at 99% interception, you are looking at a cost-exchange ratio that no Western defense economist should be comfortable with. I want you to hold on to that ratio because it does not end with one attack. Second reality, Iran's strategic patience is not a weakness, it is the operational design. Western strategic culture has enormous difficulty interpreting patience correctly. In the American frame, delay implies hesitation. Hesitation implies weakness. Weakness implies an opportunity to press. This cognitive habit has led to catastrophic strategic misreadings going back at least to Vietnam. The McNamara fallacy, the idea that what cannot be measured does not matter, is the intellectual ancestor of this problem. McNamara's analysts could count North Vietnamese casualties with precision. They could not measure resolve. They could not measure institutional learning. They could not measure the adversary's willingness to absorb cost across a multi-decade timeline. Iran has been studying that lesson. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does not operate on American budget cycles. It does not operate on election cycles. It does not need a Senate Armed Services Committee to approve the next phase of its force development. It has been building, quietly, on a timeline that makes American strategic planning look like a quarterly earnings report. The proxies are not an accident. They are not a consolation prize for a state that cannot project power conventionally. They are the architecture of a distributed cost imposition network, built precisely because Iran understood that direct confrontation with American conventional dominance was a losing game, so it changed the game. Third reality. The nuclear question is no longer a separate track. It is the organizing logic of everything else Iran is doing. This is the thing almost no mainstream analyst wants to say plainly, so I will say it. Iran's conventional force development, its proxy network, its drone program, its cost imposition logic, all of it is designed to answer one structural question. How do you survive the window between now and the moment you either have a nuclear deterrent or have made yourself too expensive to attack? North Korea answered that question one way, with the actual weapon. Iran has been attempting a different answer. Make the cost of attacking you so prohibitively high, in treasure, in proxy escalation, in regional destabilization, in oil market shock, that the rational calculus for a preventive strike never closes. And here's the thing, it has worked. Not perfectly, not without cost. But the United States has not struck Iran's nuclear facilities. Israel has not struck Iran's nuclear facilities, despite years of red lines, deadlines, and ultimatums. The cost imposition architecture is the reason why. Now, let us build the evidence ladder, because I want to show you precisely how this framework explains what happened after April 2024, and why everything America did in response was structurally predicted by the framework. After the attack, Israel conducted a limited retaliatory strike. Precise, targeted, deliberately limited. The signal was clear. We can reach you, but we are choosing restraint. The interpretation in Washington was cautiously optimistic. Escalation managed, ladder controlled, Iran deterred. I want to show you exactly why that interpretation was wrong. Iran's response to the Israeli retaliation was silence. And I have said this before in a different context. Silence is telling you something. When an actor that has just conducted the largest direct military operation in its modern history receives a retaliatory strike and says nothing, does nothing, absorbs it, that is not defeat. That is data collection. Iran was watching. It was measuring interception rates. It was measuring response times. It was measuring which systems were used, from what positions, with what coordination between American and Israeli and Jordanian and Saudi assets. The April attack was simultaneously a military operation and an intelligence operation. And the intelligence operation may have been the primary mission. Hold on to that framing, because it recontextualizes everything that comes next. If you are Iran and you have just forced the United States, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and the United Kingdom to fully activate their air defense networks in coordination for the first time in a live operational environment under real conditions, you have learned things that no satellite photograph and no signals intercept could have told you. You have learned where the seams are. You have learned the response latency. You have learned the coordination protocols. You have learned how many interceptors were expended and from which batteries. That is not a failed attack. That is a reconnaissance operation that produced strategic intelligence at a cost of approximately $80 to $100 million. An intelligence operation of that quality, conducted through conventional means, would cost an adversary many multiples of that figure and might never produce equivalent data. Now, Mainstream analysis of Iran's military capability focuses on what it can destroy. I want you to start focusing on what it can learn, because those are two different threat assessments, and only one of them is driving Iran's actual strategy. Let me give you the second layer of the evidence ladder. Since April 2024, Iranian proxy activity has not decreased. It has reorganized. Yemen's Houthi operations in the Red Sea did not stop after American and British strikes. They adapted. The target set shifted. The timing patterns changed. The drone-missile ratio evolved. This is not the behavior of a proxy network that has been deterred. This is the behavior of a distributed learning system running iterative experiments against Western defensive responses. The Red Sea disruption alone has cost global shipping an estimated $1 trillion in rerouting, insurance premiums, and delay costs. That is not a typo either. $1 trillion. And the actual cost to the Houthis of sustaining that campaign, estimated in the hundreds of millions. The cost-exchange ratio that I introduced earlier with the drone intercepts is not an isolated data point. It is a structural feature of the entire Iranian strategic system. These two narratives cannot both be true. The narrative that Iran's proxies have been degraded and deterred, and the narrative that global shipping through the Red Sea remains fundamentally disrupted. One of those is accurate. I will let you determine which one. Now let us move to the second-order implications, because this is where the analysis gets genuinely uncomfortable for the Western strategic community. America's response plan, the one being built right now in the Pentagon and in the interagency process, is structured around what I would call the attrition assumption. The assumption that sustained military pressure, combined with economic sanctions, combined with support for Israeli deterrence, will eventually degrade Iran's capacity to the point where the cost imposition architecture collapses. This assumption has one enormous problem. It has been the assumption since 1979. And Iran's strategic position in 2024 is objectively stronger than it was in 2005, 2010, or 2015. The sanctions have been in place, the covert operations have been ongoing, the proxies have been struck repeatedly, and the system has not collapsed. It has adapted and expanded. What this tells you, if you are willing to look at it directly, is that America is not running a successful attrition strategy against Iran. It is running an inadvertent resilience-building program. Every round of pressure that Iran survives produces institutional learning, organizational hardening, and, critically, narrative ammunition for the domestic constituency that argues Iran must maintain strategic autonomy at any cost. Here is what no one is measuring in the Western policy debate. The internal Iranian calculus is not primarily about whether America will strike. It is about the domestic political economy of strategic autonomy, the IRGC's institutional power, the Supreme Leader's legacy framework, the domestic legitimacy argument that revolutionary Iran cannot be coerced by external pressure. These are not abstract ideological positions. They are load-bearing political structures. And they are strengthened, not weakened, by the experience of surviving Western pressure. Every time Iran absorbs a strike, absorbs a sanction round, absorbs a proxy setback, and continues functioning, that is not a neutral outcome in Tehran's domestic political environment. That is a victory narrative, and it is available to the hardline institutional actors who have the most to lose from any fundamental strategic accommodation with the West. America's response plan assumes that pressure accumulates toward Iranian concession. The evidence of the last 45 years suggests it accumulates toward Iranian consolidation. That is not a minor analytical error. That is a foundational strategic misreading. Let me now address the nuclear dimension directly, because I said earlier it is the organizing logic and I owe you the full argument. Iran is currently assessed to be weeks, possibly days, from weapons-grade uranium enrichment capacity. This is not a fringe assessment. This comes from the IAEA. This comes from American intelligence assessments that have been partially declassified. The question of whether Iran crosses the final threshold to a testable device is no longer a question of technical capacity. It is a question of political decision. And here is the strategic geometry that Washington is struggling to acknowledge. The window for a militarily effective preventive strike on Iran's nuclear program is closing rapidly if it has not already closed. The dispersal, the hardening, the depth of facilities like Fordo, these are not academic concerns. Multiple serious military analysts have concluded that even a full American strike package, not an Israeli strike, an American strike, would delay but not destroy the Iranian nuclear program. Which means the deterrence equation is shifting, not gradually, rapidly. And the response plan being built on the assumption of American escalation dominance, on the assumption that Iran can be coerced back from the nuclear threshold, is being built on a foundation that may already be structurally obsolete. I want you to hold on to this. Not because I am telling you Iran will definitely cross the nuclear threshold in the next 12 months. I am not making that claim. I am making a different claim. The claim that the American strategic plan is optimized for an Iran that is below the threshold and can be kept there through pressure. And if that Iran no longer exists, if the threshold question is now about timing and decision rather than about capacity, then every red line, every deterrence signal, every military posture that has been designed for the old Iran is pointing at a target that has already moved. Now, let me give you the watch list, because this is not an abstract argument. There are specific indicators over the next 60 to 90 days that will tell you which trajectory is dominant. Watch the enrichment rate announcements from the IAEA. Not the political statements, the technical numbers. 90% enrichment at scale is qualitatively different from 60% enrichment. If the rate and the stockpile volume both accelerate simultaneously, that is not a bargaining signal. That is preparation. Watch the Houthi operational pattern in the Red Sea. Specifically, watch whether the target set expands beyond commercial shipping to include naval vessels in a more sustained way. The current pattern has been carefully calibrated to impose cost without triggering full escalation. A shift in that calibration would indicate a strategic decision to move to a different phase. Watch the Iraqi militia activity against American forces in the region. The tempo has decreased since early 2024. A sustained resumption, particularly if it involves more sophisticated targeting, suggests the distributed cost imposition network is being reactivated at a higher operational level. Watch the Iranian domestic political signals around the nuclear file. Specifically, watch whether the institutional actors who have historically argued for strategic patience begin to be marginalized or whether their position is reinforced. Personnel changes at the IAEA-facing negotiating team are more informative than any public statement. And watch what America does not do. The absence of a serious diplomatic initiative, the absence of a credible off-ramp construction, the continuation of maximum pressure without a visible theory of how pressure converts to resolution, that absence is itself a data point. It tells you that Washington either does not have a theory of victory in this strategic competition, or the theory it has is one it cannot publicly articulate. I have been arguing throughout this video that the real problem is not what Iran does next. It is that America's framework for predicting and responding to what Iran does next is built on assumptions that Iran has spent 15 years systematically invalidating. The cost imposition logic, the nuclear threshold dynamics, the distributed proxy architecture, the intelligence collection value of the April 2024 attack, none of these fit cleanly into the deterrence framework that American strategic planning is still organized around. And when reality does not fit the framework, there are two possible responses. You update the framework, or you reinterpret the reality to fit the framework you already have. The evidence of the last several years suggests Washington has been doing the second thing. Here's the question I want to leave you with, and I genuinely do not have the answer, which is why I want you to think about it with me. If Iran's strategic goal is not to win a conventional military confrontation with the United States, if it never was, but instead to reach a position of sufficient deterrent credibility, sufficient cost imposition capacity, and sufficient domestic political consolidation that coercive American power can no longer force a fundamental change in Iranian strategic behavior, then at what point does that goal become effectively achieved? Not declared, not announced, just quietly, structurally true. The way the Soviet Union's nuclear deterrent was quietly, structurally true long before either side was willing to say it plainly. That question has an answer. I am not sure the answer is comfortable, and I think the reason it is not being asked openly in Western policy circles is precisely because the answer may require a fundamental revision of assumptions that too many institutions, too many careers, and too many strategic frameworks have been built upon. That is what we are going to keep tracking in the weeks ahead. Compare the IAEA technical reports from the last 3 quarters against the political statements that accompanied them. The gap between those two texts is more informative than either text alone. If you find that gap is widening, you have your own answer to the question I just asked. Push back if I have gotten the cost ratios wrong. Push back if you have different IAEA data. That is what the comments are for, and I read them. We will keep having this conversation. See you in the next one.